Hey there folks, this is Misadventurer here today with the 18th developer diary for my Imperator Rome Overhaul mod project, Hegemony. This is likely going to be one of the longer, if not the longest dev diaries I've ever made, as this will be going over patch 0.6, an absolutely enormous patch for the Hegemony Alpha that includes a ton of new systems and changes, and a massive and very complicated economy rework, which is going to be the main focus of this video as I talk about how I have reworked multiple core systems to work together to achieve a completely new and balanced economy system for Hegemony. Now, before we get into all that, just a quick note. As usual, the link in the description will lead you to the Hegemony Discord, where you can join and be part of a community of people who get to see all of the Hegemony work as it's happening. I share screenshots and comments on there about my work on the mod super regularly, and I'm often looking for feedback from people, so if you want to follow the development of Hegemony super closely, more than welcome to join the Hegemony Discord. Right, let's go ahead and get started with this video. There's just so much to talk about, so we just got to get started with it and get going. I hope I don't forget anything here, as there's so many different things that I've added in 0.6. And I guess one more thing I should mention actually right at the start is that when this video goes live, patch 0.6 will also have gone live on Steam Workshop and on the Paradox Plaza. So feel free to go ahead and just ignore this video and start playing, but you may want the orientation this video will provide about what's going on with all the changes of 0.6. And if you want to watch this video and then go play the patch, that would probably be what I'd recommend. But you do you. This game I've created for you, so I'm happy for you to play it in whatever manner you want, whether it includes my little introduction or not. Right, having said that, let's get started. First things first, I want to talk about some of the map changes I've made before we get into the economic stuff. First of all, I have made a change to the Phthiosis region over in kind of central Greece, central Hellas, which involves the division of two city-states, which were Amphisa and Opois with a Y, into 8 city-states. So we now have Opus with a U, which is more historically accurate naming-wise, the city-state of Alope, and the city-state of Hiampolis. Over here, I've split apart Amphisa and moved it down here, and we now have Triteia up here, Aigetian up here, Oantheia up here, and Oinion over here. Now, this division into 8 is more accurate. These are all different city-states, or at least sort of believed to have been different city-states at the time. And on top of dividing apart these larger city-states, some of the earliest areas I actually worked on in the mod back when I initially had a lot less experience with designing different provinces and city-states, so this was a much-needed rework for this particular area. On top of dividing up the city-states like this, I've also made some serious changes to their alignment. Now, culture-wise, they're all part of the Phthiotian culture. Of course, if you remember, this is where the Locrians live. And there's sort of two groups of Locrians. There's the Locrians who live over here by Opus, and the Locrians who live down here. And historically, the Locrians over here joined the Peloponnesian League, and the Locrians over here joined the Delian League. But not at first. And that's the main thing I've realized in doing further research, is to represent these two areas as uniformly aligned already is just not really accurate. So I've actually changed it so that most of the Locrians are unaligned, including Amphisa, while Opus, who was known as a Lacedaemonian ally and actually early on presented some problems for Athenai navally, because Opois had a very kind of fast pirate-style fleet who they were using to raid Delian territories, while Athenai was preoccupied with other obligations. They start as Peloponnesian aligned, while everyone else in the area is unaligned, including, incidentally, Elatea and Delphi, who actually were previously Peloponnesian aligned as well. It's more accurate for 431 to make them unaligned. Now, this is a pretty serious loss of alignment over here for both the Peloponnesians and the Delians, but it actually gets even more extreme when I scroll a bit further up and talk about Macedon, who is now actually unaligned as well. I've also changed Macedon's flag to be more historically accurate for 431 BCE. At the time, Macedon was not using its famous sort of star flag that it would develop later. That's more associated with the, Philip II and Alexander. But at this point, the lion symbol was probably the symbol of Macedon, according to its coinage at least. This was the symbol of Macedon's current king, who I've not created yet, Perdiccas II, who I will create as a character later on. Either way, Macedon is unaligned, and I could genuinely spend the entire rest of this very long video just talking about the the center of the earth deep rabbit hole I fell into trying to learn about Macedonian geopolitics in the 430s. If you ever want to just lose your mind, try to research Macedon's political shenanigans during this time. It's very complicated, and to cut a very long story short, Macedon is unaligned when the game begins, although has a definite anti-Athenian lean, but they're not Peloponnesian aligned, and they're not allied or have any relationship with Lacedaemon at first. Macedon will historically actually develop an alliance with Lacedaemon, although it's more so because of events that happen after the game begins, in terms of the timeline, where they're invaded by the Odrysian kingdom, who are aligned with Athenai, have an alliance with Athenai. So Macedon, in response, allies with Lacedaemon, not because it already had any predilection towards Lacedaemon or the Peloponnesians, but it basically allied with the enemy of its enemy, right? Its enemy, well, it's even more complicated. It allied with the enemy of its enemy's ally. So it's attacked by the Odrysians, who are allied with Athenai, who are enemies of Lacedaemon. So that's basically how Macedon gets involved in the Peloponnesian War. But prior to this, remember, this is all happening in the 420s. Now we're going back to the 440s, 430s. Macedon does actually have a war with Athenai, but not as part of the Peloponnesian War. It's actually earlier than the Peloponnesian War, and it's in relation to a complicated set of things involving Potidaea. Of course Potidaea is involved. And Macedon, it's super complicated, but basically Macedon goes to war with Athenai very, very briefly, and then they kind of do a weird about-face, and they form an alliance with Athenai in order to both fight the Corinthians, but then when the Corinthians show up to defend Potidaea, but then Macedon backstabs Athenai and resumes their war, but then they lose at the Battle of Potidaea alongside the Corinthians, and Macedon basically enters essentially a ceasefire with Athenai. And that's all happening right before 431 BCE. And so on January 1st, 431 BCE, in my opinion, the most realistic way to depict Macedon is currently at peace with Athenai. They just fought a war against them after betraying them, after signing a deal with them, after being at war with them. But they're not Peloponnesian aligned. They basically have an independent basis for not liking Athenai, unrelated to the Peloponnesian alignment. But they're later on in time going to become Peloponnesian aligned because the Odrysians attack them, and the Odrysians present such a serious problem for them that they need more support from the Peloponnesians, as the Odrysians are supported by and supporting the Athenians in the north. All of this complicated northern politics stuff leads eventually to the famous expeditionary force led by Brasidas, the Lacedaemonian general, up to the north of the Aegean, where this big Peloponnesian army kind of roams around doing crazy stuff in this way that the Delians weren't prepared for. They didn't think the Lacedaemonians could actually march an army out of Hellas again, so it's a whole complicated thing. But basically, all of this is to say, Macedon, at the start of my mod, is unaligned, which is historically accurate for this very specific moment in time, but their historical mission that they will follow once I design all the missions during the beta will lead them gently into the Peloponnesian League because of the circumstances of the world. So that is the situation with Macedon. Finally, I have a new region added to the map with this update, but it is in Asia Minor, but it's not another region of Asia Minor Hellenic colony city-states. Instead, it is actually a Parson satrapy, Phrygia Minor. So this is the first of what will eventually be a number of satrapy-style playable countries in Asia Minor along the interior of the coastline. And Phrygia Minor is the first one and the only one for now. Now, they are of Phrygian culture, which is of the Parson culture group. They actually have the appearance of Parsons in terms of their characters and their buildings. They have the Parson-style buildings, just to differentiate them. They're unaligned. All of the satrapies will be unaligned. And the main thing that really separates them from other playable countries is their government form, satrapy. Let me just go ahead and read this to explain what's going on. Satrapies are client kingdoms ruled by satraps who are subordinate to the Parson Empire. Though the empire once considered them integrated provinces, Parsa's decline had allowed many satrapies to regain their de facto independence and for their satraps to restore once lost hereditary rights. Accordingly, if the satrap retires, is deposed, or dies, then they are succeeded by one of their family members in accordance with the current succession law. Satrapies remain de jure subjects of Parsa and suffer severe economic penalties due to their tribute obligations, which is reflected by a very punishing negative 25% tax, manpower, and commerce nationally. To escape these, the satrapy must complete a mission, which is not in the game yet, it'll be in the beta, to declare full independence from Parsa and transform their government. So they're going to be able to do a mission to basically become a just independent kingdom and keep their current king, or even a democracy or a oligarchy, or some other kinds of governments as well. So that's the basic idea with the satrapies. I think it's interesting to include Parsan territories without it being just one big Parsa tag, as it's more accurate for there to be some independence going on. Parsa really kind of didn't bounce back after their 2 invasions, which would have been about 50 years before the game starts. So essentially, Parsa has been in a state of decline, at least in this part of their empire. Obviously, they're doing fine in their heartland, but especially after the Athenians sign that big peace treaty with them about 20 years before the game starts, it really severely limits Parsa's ability to extend its influence in Western Asia Minor, not just on the coastline where they're forced to free all the city-states, but even their Parsan satrapies, they kind of struggle to have the same sway over. And so Parsa's decline leads to the transition of some of these satrapies towards independence, where they're now, they're able to have hereditary rule, which was or hereditary rights, which was something that was being restored as Parsa's influence waned. I'll eventually create an entire series of mechanics dealing with Parsa's waning influence over the satrapies. But if you were to play as Phrygia Minor, they do start with the forced Medism diplomatic position, if you remember the Medism system, so that's integrated into this as well. But anyways, there's not a lot of unique stuff here. They use the Hellenic-style units, and they have the Hellenic-style names for things, including all the text, so that's not like customized for the Parsans for now. But I think that's fine. All these systems are designed to work with that balancing in mind. And I think it's just cool to let people play as some of the Parsan satrapies for kind of a different experience. They are unaligned, and they're going to be able to act as kind of an interesting swing element on these borders of the Delian League, where normally there's just uniform Delian alignment, except for a handful of Peloponnesian League members here or there. But this basically creates an interesting pressure on these areas that are typically very safe for the Delian League, unless the individual city-states start to get funny ideas. We'll talk about that more in just a moment. In fact, we'll talk about that more right now, because let's finally get to the final addition with this patch to the sort of the map screen, or kind of the bigger picture of gameplay, which is the introduction of situations. Now, let me start by just showing what a country that doesn't have a situation yet looks like. And basically, this is a new system I've created that replaces and uses the same text as the heritage system. So, Phrygia Minor has no situation currently, and this is what it says. This is Hegemony's default situation for countries during the mod's development until they either receive a unique situation or are coded to use generic situations. After the 1.0 release, please let me know if you find any countries in-game with the situation. So, what's going on with situations exactly? Well, in Hegemony, a country's situation summarizes their recent history and what challenges they face in 431 BCE. So it's sort of like a starting... So it's in like my campaigns that I've done, I've had like a starting situation part of my first episodes where I kind of talk about this. So I basically created a gameplay version of that part of my YouTuber stuff, which I put into my mod. For some countries, including all interesting countries, their situation text also describes unique mechanics and missions. This is really important. For interesting countries, which for this patch I've reduced back to Athenai and Lacedaemon only, and they have unique situations and stuff. We'll talk about that in a moment. Their situation text is less about their lore and more about their unique mechanics and their missions. So let me just first preface that at this point there are no unique mechanics and no unique missions in the mod yet. This is all going to come in the beta. But I do have the text laying out how this works for both Athenai and Lacedaemon. And the situations will also be able to change as one progresses through the missions. So for example, all interesting countries will have 3 available missions, basically the equivalent of 3 kind of mission trees, and they're all mutually exclusive with each other, representing a historical route, or let me rephrase, representing the historical route, and then 2 ahistorical alternative routes, one that's more feasible, one that's more out there. So, as an example, let's start with Athenai. Their situation is called Ambitions of Empire, and brace yourself because there is a lot to talk about with this situation. At the beginning of Hegemony, Athenai rules over the Delian League. However, her authority is not yet absolute, and will falter if the member city-states of her faction assert their independence. Delian subjects can do this in the following ways. 1. Demanding that Atenai recognize them as an ally instead of a subject, or 2. Demanding that Atenai agree to grant them independence, at which point they will leave the Delian League and become unaligned. Declaring war against Atenai for their independence, at which point they will become Peloponnesian aligned and attempt to join the Peloponnesian League. Member city-states who are Athenian subjects can make either kind of demand after completing a unique mission, and will be able to declare war for independence with Peloponnesian support if Atenai refuses. So they won't just immediately declare war normally. Instead, they'll either ask Atenai in an event, can you make me an ally instead of my current subject status? Or they'll ask Atenai to grant them full independence, where they are just released from subjecthood with no alliance, and then they also change their government type to unaligned. Their population isn't automatically changed, they have to change it themselves. That's one cost of changing your government allegiance, is that your population remains what it was before. And of course, if they ask for full independence and are denied by Atenai, or declined by Atenai, then they declare war on Atenai, and their government becomes Peloponnesian aligned, and then they try to join the Peloponnesian League. They try to form an alliance with Lacedaemon. So, member states who are Athenian subjects can make either kind of demand after completing a unique mission, and will be able to declare war for independence with Peloponnesian support if Atenai refuses. I just said that. Member city-states who are Athenian allies are unable to make these demands. So, a Delian League member, for example, when the game begins, there's only one Delian League member who's an ally, not a subject, and that's Corcyra. Corcyra, in real history, has just joined the Delian League, like a second ago. In fact, Corcyra joining the Delian League and it's noted that they were an ally of Atenai. They were not part of the normal Delian system. They start as an ally, not a subject, and this is a huge advantage for them over other Delian members because they don't have all the subject obligations. Remember, subjects are paying, and it's actually historically accurately only 5% of their overall treasury, monthly treasury to Atenai, which sounds like a small amount, but that's actually like the most amount that was likely believed to come from the Delian subjects. Then they're protected by Atenai. They join Atenai in wars, and they can become independent by completing a mission, which is what the previous text talked about. And this isn't noted there, but they also have some limited diplomacy because of it as well. But either way. So having a Delian member who's an ally, not a subject, is safer for Atenai, because that means that they can't demand, obviously, becoming an ally, because they're already an ally. They also can't demand independence. So, in order to secure her place in the world, Atenai must complete one of 3 unique missions. Each takes a different approach and is mutually exclusive with the other. So, here's where we have, and this is the way all of the different unique situations will be sort of written and presented. First, a historical accuracy approach, or I should say the historical route that Atenai was taking and would continue to take. Then we have a not historically accurate, but kind of feasible approach that could have been like a slight adjustment to what happened. And then third, we have a really out there, though still possible way it could have gone, a very ahistorical approach. So the first way is continue to dominate the member city-states and ensure they remain subjects, not allies. This is the historical path that Atenai can take, and the Atenai AI and all the AIs that have different missions will always be coded to go the historical routes under normal circumstances. This mission allows Atenai to form the Athenian Empire, which was their long-term goal, and annex all of their subjects. So this is basically the continue the Pericles policy approach, where as Atenai going with this mission, you basically are continuing to try and just overlord over all the subjects. You then get special mechanics and ways to reduce the chance or prevent subjects from asking to be granted independence or to become allies, and you're trying to basically keep all the subjects placated so that you can gradually work towards doing a big formation button to immediately annex everyone at the same time to form one single country, the Athenian Empire. Obviously a giant power boost that you need to work really hard to achieve. This is basically representing what the goal of the Delian League kind of was from the actual historical Athenian leadership. This is where they wanted things to go. And so that's the historical mission that you have access to. The next mission you can pick instead is pivot to diplomacy and lead the effort to transition all subjects to allies. This mission allows Atenai to remove the ability of Delian subjects to demand independence, preserving and ultimately strengthening the Delian League as a faction. So you might think that this just sounds like a weaker version of what I just told you. This is an approach where you're sort of doing the like British decolonization thing, where you're kind of leading in Hearts of Iron 4, I should say, where you're kind of like leading the charge of decolonization yourself, even though you're weakening yourself, in order to strengthen the Commonwealth. In this mod, the idea here is that because once you start this alternative alt history mission, you remove the ability of the subjects to demand full-on independence, and you just therefore also remove their ability to declare war and join the Peloponnesians for independence. At this point, all they can do is request to become an ally. And there are ways in this mission that I'll create where you basically can you can basically reduce the rate at which they can make this request. So the idea with this is, instead of just continuing to dominate the Delian League as they kind of ideally wanted to, right? The kind of idealistic, we're Athenai, we're, in this golden age, we're just going to do whatever we want, which requires a pretty harsh and very careful management of your empire of subjects. In the second mission, it's kind of the more pragmatic and kind of more careful, kind of almost sneaky way, where it's more of doing the scheme as opposed to just continuing business as usual, where instead of just trying to keep the Delian League from collapsing, as was starting to happen during the Peloponnesian War, instead it's no, we definitely support everyone becoming independent and just be part of a Delian alliance, a faction of equals. We just need to do it, in the right way. So we're going to gradually promote everyone to allies in kind of our own terms. And this mission allows you to basically control the burn rate of the Delian League's collapse, but in the form of everyone becoming allies instead of everyone possibly becoming independent, or worse, becoming Peloponnesians. This is basically the wartime pragmatism approach, where an alt history idea of Athenai considering the severe danger they're in from the Peloponnesian War, which in real history, if you don't know, they lost the Peloponnesian War, so they were in fact in severe danger. So this is basically how Athenai could have won the Peloponnesian War, by changing their Delian policy, but it's still within the bounds of what feasibly could have been the case for the Athenian approach, as although in real history they didn't do this, this is the sort of clever thing they could have done, where they basically tried to kind of control the breakdown of the Delian League by stepping back and kind of walking back from where it had gone. But by being able to control the transition to allies, they're able to keep people as subjects more reliably for longer as they transition everyone overall to being allies, so that they continue to benefit from their tribute economy. But a big part of Athenai's economic situation is their over-reliance on the tribute of the League. And so one high-level Athenai build that I kind of envision that I would actually love playing as for my own campaigns with this mod in the future is making the goal to transition Athenai from being over-reliant on all their tribute to being truly focused on commerce, which doesn't require you to have subjects. You can trade just as easily with allies, right? And so I think that this approach is really good with a goal of trying to kind of slowly wean Athenai out of its kind of precarious Delian League situation, given that the city-states are all trending towards trying to get independent from Athenai in one form or another, whether as an ally or as an unaligned independent nation, or as an enemy even potentially. So basically, that's how the second mission works. The third option is organize a conspiracy across the Delian League to overthrow the Athenian democracy, allowing Athenai to adopt an oligarchy or even restore her old monarchy. The radical new direction Athenai will take will enable various outcomes for the fate of the Delian League. So this is the really out there kind of crazy option, where this is the full alt history kind of thing. Imagine in Hearts of Iron 4, you've got in the Soviet Union, the Stalinist path, where you just do what happened historically. You've got the left and right parties of the Communist Party, which are kind of the feasibly could have happened, but they're still sort of historical, and things are kind of they're not historical, but things are more close to what happened, and it represents what could have happened within the party. And then you have the Tsarist Reformation path, which is just complete ahistorical fantasy almost, but still kind of feasible, it could have happened, right? That's the idea here, where I've got a historical path for all the interesting countries, a ahistorical, but just kind of tweaked and more kind of this would have been better if it went like this for them path, where they're what happened wrong for them in history, here's what they could have done that may have been a better idea. And then the kind of crazy path where things just go all over the place. So basically with this path, you basically play as a conspiracy to overthrow the Athenian democracy, because the democracy of Athenai is really the heart and soul of the Delian League. This is the faction that truly, is what the Delian League is there to support, more so than the Athenai as a city-state, as it were. And of course, someone like Pericles, the biggest Delian proponent in the world, is like the physical embodiment of the Athenian democracy. So basically trying to overthrow the democracy to either adopt a Peloponnesian-style oligarchy, and of course when Athenae lost the war, this is what Lacedaemon forced them to do, was to adopt an oligarchy, or even restore the old Athenian monarchy from hundreds of years ago. And the radical new direction Athenae takes allows them to do funny stuff with the Delian League. You're going to have options like keeping the Delian League as is, and you just rule it as a new type of government with reactions from the almost uniformly democratic Delian subjects, where they are then going to have their own local, oligarchic coups and whatnot. Or you basically just destroy the Delian League and say everyone goes free and everyone becomes unaligned, and every Delian pop on the map becomes unaligned because the Delian League is just dissolved, or something like that, where it's just kind of a free-for-all chaotic world shakeup. Or even things like giving over control of the Delian League to Kokyra or some other powerful member, and then Athenae themselves becoming independent. There's all sorts of crazy things that can happen here that you can pick between for different advantages or really interesting kind of scenarios. Now, the other country that I have a interesting situation for is, of course, Lacedaemon. So let's go ahead and take a look at that next. Their situation is called Good Order. At the beginning of Hegemony, Lacedaemon strictly adheres to eunomia, good order. Under this system, Lacedaemon maintains a drastic divide between Spartiates, who are required by law to serve as soldiers, and the Helots, conquered people subject to brutal repression and used to perform almost all work. And again, remember, I don't actually have these modifiers and everything, all the missions set up yet. This is all just sort of explaining what will be in the game by 1.0. Lacedaemon has two national modifiers, the Spartiates and the Helots, which provide substantial modifiers to the output of Lacedaemon's population. The Spartiates initially provides the following effects: 10% levy size, 10% national manpower, but minus 50% national commerce. The Helots initially provides the following effects: 10% national tax, 10% monthly food, and 100% unrest. In order to decide the role Eunomia will continue to take in her society, Lacedaemon must complete one of three unique missions. Each is mutually exclusive with the others. So the first and historical mission, continue and even further entrench Eunomia in Lacedaemon. This mission allows Lacedaemon to improve the bonuses of the Spartiates and the Helots. And the second mission, which is ahistorical but more feasible, is begin reforms to shift Lacedaemon away from the policies of Eunomia. This mission allows Lacedaemon to reduce the malices of the Spartiates and the Helots. Finally, organize a conspiracy to overthrow the Lacedaemonian diarchy in a Helot revolution, making Helot the native culture of Lacedaemon, and allowing Lacedaemon to change its name, its government, and even become unaligned. So this is the really out there crazy scenario that could have happened, but definitely was not going to happen. So to kind of go over what this third one would look like, essentially you would sort of become a Helot country, and you kind of switch the Helot pops and the Lacedaemonian pops in terms of their social roles, with the Helot pops then being able to change Lacedaemon's name, release, or even play as the country of Messenia over here in the Messenia region, which is currently under Lacedaemonian occupation, of course, and all sorts of other crazy stuff. You can dissolve the Peloponnesian League, you can become unaligned, you can do all sorts of crazy things that I'll create later. So that basically summarizes the three missions for Lacedaemon. Now, the idea with Lacedaemon's situation here and these modifiers is, when thinking about what's the quintessential gameplay that I want the main interesting countries to really have, I knew from the beginning Athenae needs to be focused on diplomacy and managing the Delian League, which was a huge central focus of Athenae, almost more so than the war itself. So Athenae's situation completely revolves around the diplomatic role Athenae plays in the Delian League and its relationship to the statuses of different members, which was a huge concern of Athenae historically. Whereas with Lacedaemon, although they similarly are in charge, although it's not, everyone's co-equal, they have this giant network of alliances with all the different Peloponnesian League members. Lacedaemon's concerns of the time are not in diplomacy, but in their internal struggles to maintain their conservative society. And I think it's much more interesting for Lacedaemon to have their special mechanics focus in on their weird, very unique society that even for the time was considered kind of out there and strange, and how Lacedaemon tries to manage the downsides of it. So obviously, in a society where citizens are not allowed by law to engage in most commercial activity, there's a giant commerce malice, right? And in a system where all of the slaves are treated as essentially enemy soldiers for legal purposes, there's enormous unrest all over the place. And these modifiers are basically going to be improved by the first mission, the historical mission, with their bonuses being boosted up, so that basically Lacedaemon leans into the weird nature of their system. Or the second mission allows them to reduce the malices, so they don't get as many bonuses, but they have less severe malices, allowing them to focus a bit more on letting in commerce, reducing the unrest. Or with the third option, they basically cause the modifiers to sort of reverse on themselves, and now you have a a crazy new radical situation where all the normal boundaries and rules of Lacedaemon society are flipped around, and it's all crazy. So I'm going to design the actual missions during the beta, like I've said before. So all of these modifiers and these missions are not in the game with 0.6. This is just a kind of UI overview of how they work. But I did want to talk about how I'm planning to create these unique mechanics for both of these countries. Okay, that was a lot of explanation, and we were only just getting started. So I'm going to take a quick second, text my girlfriend. Okay, and I need to drink some coffee. Oh, need more. All right, let's do this thing. I've thought for a long time about how to even begin to talk about the economy rework in this patch, because there was a lot to talk about. So let's just get into it. So first of all, and this is related to the economy rework, but this is one thing I can talk about while on the map screen. One major addition to 0.6, to Hegemony with 0.6, is I completely redistributed all pops across the entire map. You may have noticed, actually, as I've been sort of zooming around, but basically every single tile on this map has had its pop numbers reorganized in alignment with the changes that have come with the economy rework. So, for example, every single settlement tile has the exact same number of pops of the same types. In terms of cities, there's basically 4 tiers of cities. There's most cities that are small cities that have this starting distribution, larger cities that have this distribution, Corinthos, which has this distribution, and then the fourth kind is Athenai, that is this distribution. So all these numbers are the correct ratios for the pop ratios, so that as time goes on, moving around pops and whatnot, the ratios will change. But basically, this is, for now, the way I've redesigned everything. Now, every single province in the game, especially for these larger like tribal kingdoms and whatnot, have had cities added in to act as the provincial capital in historically accurate places. Macedon, for example, has cities all over the place now. You get the idea. So, having noted that really quick, and that's a quick thing to note for what was actually multiple days of just sheer work to do this giant pop reorganization. But it was kind of relaxing. I just throw on like a podcast and I just kind of mindlessly do copy and paste, move all the pops around. It's not, too involved. But I had to, really think about how am I laying out all the pops and where should there be cities. I took the chance to also make any changes to city locations based on my further research over the months. So anyways, now that I've mentioned the pop demographic changes, let's get into the actual pop effects and the way the economy rework of 0.6 is going to work. So let me just hop into Athenai as the example here. Okay, so first and foremost, let's just talk about the pop types directly. That's probably the easiest way to start things off. Now, a lot of the changes I've made are are very much based off the initial pop rework that I did earlier in the mod, but this has all been reworked with the buildings, the trade goods, and the techs all in mind to kind of go at the same time. So it is worth going over everything again just to talk about how it all works now, as this is the way going forward that the economy in this mod will work. Now, first and foremost, it's best to probably think about the 5 pop types as 3 kind of core pop types and 2 supporting pop types. The 3 core pop types are the Atastoi, the Politis, and the Metoikoi. And I've also made some name and localization changes as we go. And the 2 supporting pop types are the Thetis and the Dwaloi. Now, in terms of very quickly what these are, I'll talk about this much more later on when I have probably like an hour of going over the economy developments tree, but essentially the polites are just your regular citizenry. They typically are not doing like manual labor, like they're living not like a life of luxury, but they tend to have more privileges and they tend to be wealthier. The Aristoi are a minority of the polites that are considered aristocratic. They have famous family names. They tend to live in like villas. These are like the kind of self-proclaimed elite of the polites, even if they don't really have different legal status than the polites. The Metoikoi are not citizens, but they're of any sort of class. These are basically any permanent resident, a foreigner, someone who just lives in the polis but isn't a citizen. And this could include rich dignitaries or paupers, right? Metoikoi are a very, very class-diverse group. But typically for the mod, this kind of represents wealthier people who can afford to move around. And Metoikoi are typically also citizens of another polis or of just a non-Hellenic background. But they're not considered citizens in the polis system. And of course, the Hellenic polis system is a central part of the lore of what's going on with the economy rework in terms of how I'm kind of representing everything. So Metoikoi are basically the equivalent of kind of immigrant families or their descendants who don't have citizenship. Citizenship in this time period is mostly about descent, as opposed to like you can just like do something to get citizenship. You can, as a Metoikoi, get citizenship, but it's very uncommon. Most of the time, citizenship is something that you inherit as a birthright and not as something you can get during your lifetime. And so the children and families of Metoikoi are also considered Metoikoi. And then we have the two supporting types, the Thetes, who are basically like craftsmen, laborers, kind of industrious people. Some of them are citizens, some of them are not, but as a group, they kind of are referenced here in their class format, right? The class of people, the Thetes. And then finally, we have the Dwaloi, who are enslaved people. So the Thetes are all free. Some are citizens, some are foreigners. But the Dwaloi, as a group, are all enslaved. These are people doing all sorts of slave labor in different formats. So, in terms of what the actual gameplay effects of these pop types are, the polites is the most balanced. The polites, which is typically a majority or a plurality of the citizenry, or of the pops in any tile, is going to provide base tax, local manpower, research, monthly splendor, and local-based trade routes. Now, it actually, of all the different pop types, provide the most local manpower. That should be noted. And also, ignore the actual numbers here, because this is different amounts of pops. They all have similar happiness, but they have different amounts, so just ignore the numbers. Just let me explain how everything balances out, sort of pop to pop. So, politis, tax, manpower, research, monthly splendor, and local-based trade routes, the flat amount. And then we have Aristoi. They provide base tax, manpower, research, monthly splendor, and pop realignment speed for the tile. Now, they provide more base tax, but less manpower than politis. They provide the same amount of research, and they provide, I believe, more monthly splendor. Actually, I don't remember for sure, but it might be the same amount. It's pretty similar either way. And they provide a unique modifier, pop realignment speed, to represent how happy local aristocrats will help a location to align with the state's alignment, right? Delian Pelt Legion. Because that's what alignment means in this mod, is it means alignment with the state's, position. So the Aristoi provide a realignment bonus for their tile. Then we have the Metoikoi, local manpower, research, migration attraction, local-based trade routes, and a modifier on local-based trade routes. So they provide, like the Aristoi, less manpower than politis. They provide, I think, the same amount of research. I think all three provide the same amount of research. They also provide migration attraction, because happy, productive Metoikoi will encourage others to migrate to the tile. That's what the Metoikoi are. They're migrants or the descendants of migrants, so it makes sense. They don't provide a positive or negative splendor level. They're kind of neutral, whereas the two kinds of citizens, right, politis and Aristoi are both citizens, they provide splendor. And then Thetes and Dwaloi, although it doesn't show it here in the UI, they do provide negative splendor, but not as an output, rather they provide it as a pop impact. So it's a bit hard to explain, but basically, the politis and Aristoi provide splendor by being there in the tile, and they also provide more splendor if they're happier and they have a higher output. The Dwaloi and Thetes provide negative splendor, but they don't provide it as an output because otherwise happier Thetis, for example, would provide more negative splendor as they got happier, which doesn't make any sense. Instead, Thetis provide a sort of an unchanging amount of negative splendor based on the number of Thetis and the number of Dwaloi in a tile. So the more like workers and slaves in a location, regardless of their output or their happiness, the more splendor reduction is added to the tile. And overall, most tiles tend to have negative splendor trend at the start. In fact, you'll notice that things look pretty apocalyptic across the seemingly splendorous, Athenian core. That's because the balance I've gone for with the economy rework is that all of your tiles are basically starting off in a bad spot. And so the gradual investment in the technology will not take a neutral, fine civilization and just make it super, super strong. You're taking a system that's already starting in kind of a dire strait and building it up to be good and sustainable. That's the kind of balance I want, because normally you start the game and you already have like this like completely manageable population. There's so many different mechanics that just don't need to be worried about. You almost never need to worry genuinely about food, unrest, unless you're really, really aggressive. Because this game, this mod, is much more about managing existing territories than about expanding to new territories all over the place. I want each tile to feel like a constant struggle to balance a bunch of different important resources and mechanics. So I'll talk about this more later, but basically the severe happiness problems across the board are a common thing over this entire world. Corinthos happens to be happier, it's Corinthos, but yeah, so that is something I wanted to note. That's not a mistake, that's a core part of how this is designed. Okay, so having said all that, the Metoikoi, they provide flat-based trade routes. They provide more than the Politis do, and they also provide a trade routes bonus. So you can already kind of see what's going on here with this design. The Politis, for either a tax or a commerce economy, and with the way I've designed this, you can do tax or commerce specializations on a tile level. Tile individual, like settlement individual strategies are unlocked with this mod, because I am like essentially a mad genius. I'm like a mad scientist with this crazy mod I've created. So basically, the level of min-maxing I have unlocked for you all is truly just staggering, as you can specialize individual tiles to do different things, not just provinces and not just your whole country. Of course, you can also specialize everything uniformly, which is typically going to probably be a good idea, but either way, Politis are balanced between tax and trade routes, and they provide the most manpower. So a very good pop type to focus on first and foremost. Adastoy are more leaning towards tax. Metoikoi are more focused towards trade routes. And of course, the reason I've changed from having commerce output to trade routes is that commerce output doesn't actually work in this engine correctly. So I need it to be in the form of trade routes, which works fine, because I've also, as part of 0.6, done a complete trade good overhaul to make commerce economies work, because I got too much time on my hands, clearly. But okay, so basically, Adastoy, tax-oriented, Politis are balanced, Metoikoi are commerce economy-oriented. And then we have the two supporting pop types. The Thetis tend to support a commerce economy, although they're not bad for either kind. They offer ship recruit speed for the tile, base resource production, which of course helps a commerce economy because they have more resources to sell, although this can obviously be good for other reasons as well. A flat pop output for the whole tile, great for everyone, and a local monthly food modifier. And this is actually helpful when paired with the local monthly food produced by the Dwaloi, who produce a lot of your food. So I've made a huge design change with food to be much more focused on pops and buildings than just trade goods. In fact, trade, pops, and buildings all provide some amount of food, but they all provide less food than before, and you need more food than before. So I've tried to make the food insecurity of the classical age a core mechanic. You now can no longer just ignore food altogether. You need to tie up a lot of your trade routes and just importing food to feed a lot of your provinces, or have Dwaloi make the food for you. They also provide supply limit, local population growth for the tile, and a local tax bonus. So you can kind of see that a min-maxed tax economy tile is going to have mostly Politis, some Adastoy, and some Dwaloi, with maybe Thetis helping out with pop output, and the Metoikoi don't hurt either. They add more good modifiers. Whereas a commerce economy-oriented tile is going to have Politis and Metoikoi, with Thetis providing additional resources and pop output, although you may need the Dwaloi just to feed the tile, and the out-of-story still provide bonuses. So I want every tile to feel as though it needs all 5 types to some extent, but you can kind of safely specialize a tile into 2 or 3 pop types, as opposed to how it works in the base game, where you basically choose to, like, you basically in the early game want freemen, and then in the end game you want nobles. That's basically how Imperator Rome works pop-wise. It's more complicated, but like that's the way that I play, and I tend to do pretty well. So now it's way more complicated. Now you can't just have Adastory be the center of your world. You need to support Adastory with Dwaloi. You can't just have Metoikoi be your entire situation. You need to have a supporting population of Thetes to produce more resources to sell to support the commerce economy of the Metoikoi. And you're going to have Polites anyways, because keep in mind, we're not talking about 5 pop types that are evenly split 20-20-20-20, right? We're talking about pop types that have very different ratios, right? Within cities, the ratios are 5% Adistoi, 25% Polites, 20% Metoikoi, 30% Thetes, and 20% Dwaloi. And in settlements, 0% Adistoi, 10% Polites, 5% Metoikoi, 30% Thetes, and 55% Dwaloi. So even though I've designed the pop outputs in a way that have all these kind of webs and mirrors with each other, you're still fighting against the historically accurate ratios, which is where my previously introduced mandates become quite helpful to actually allow for individual provincial capitals or all of the territories to get a bit of extra ratio for the pop type you want to focus on. So that is the pop type overview, but the explanation of the economy rework chugs along with even more discussion as we get into now the buildings. Now, there is so much to talk about with the building rework. I'm using all the same building icons and many of the same names as before, but I've completely reworked what all the buildings do, both for cities and for settlements. Let's just get into it. Now, the basic idea with the buildings in Hegemony, as of 0.6, is most buildings are one of 2 kinds. They are either a building that costs 500 gold before modifiers to build, and they take 1 year to build, and they provide a modifier. They provide 2 positive and 1 negative modifier for the tile, and there can be up to 5 in a city. There's a limit of 5, and this is true for forts, for ports, for homes, for markets, and for workshops. They all work this way, and also for shrines, for thumiles. And then there is a sort of super version of the building that requires a technology to be able to be built. For example, the Acropolis, which is like a super version of the fort, has a souped up, powerful version of the fort bonuses, and it doesn't have the malice, but it can only be built once in a territory, as in there can only be 1 at a time. You can always rebuild it if you lose it, but you can only have 1 in a city territory. And it requires an invention in order to access. This requires that Acropolis invention back from the military developments tech tree. And then the Neorion, the sort of shipyard, requires, first of all, it to be a port, something like a Piraeus as an example. But it also requires the Thalassoporon, which is actually over in the military developments. This is the initial naval tech. So you can get this very, very easily, but you basically need to opt in to doing naval stuff in the tech tree to even unlock the shipyard. And then are the 3 economic ones that require different economic techs I'll talk about later. Finally is the temple, which is going to work the same way. This will require a tech in the culture developments tree, not the religious one, oddly enough, which I will design for the next major patch. So I'll be getting back to the tech requirement for this later. Just know that this will require a tech. It's not going to be available from the start the way it is currently, as I've not designed the culture development tech tree yet. And then there's also 4 sort of free-floating buildings that have the larger cost and the limit of 1 per territory. The larger cost, by the way, being 5 times the cost and 5 times the build time. So, for example, a port, again, 500 gold before modifiers and 1 year before modifiers. The shipyard actually doesn't show it there. I guess I can show this one here because you can see the modifiers here. This requires 2.5k before modifiers to build and 5 years to build. So now the build time reduction you're going to get from the economic tech tree, a bit more important, right? You don't normally care much about build time, I imagine, but now if you're hoping to do a lot of building projects, you're going to be tying up your cities in these big projects for a long time. And the extra money is balanced around the new economic kind of norms that you're going to see with most cities and playable city-states. So to get into it a bit more thoroughly, starting off with cities, we have the fort, which per level provides 1 fort level, 10% local fort defense, and the malice of 5% population output. This basically represents that a more fortified city is also going to just be kind of worse at being a city, but it's more fortified. So you can no longer just fortify up every city you want. I mean, there's also obviously fort maintenance, which I've also rebalanced. We'll talk about the economic stuff in a bit. Well, we'll talk about the economic screen a bit more in a bit as it kind of goes over some of the bigger picture stuff. But essentially a level 5 fort, 5 fort level, that's really good, but 25% reduced population output for the tile. So now you have to actually consider, do I want to really fortify my cities because there's an output malice? Now remember that in Hegemony, both cities and metropolises have a 1 fort level by default. You don't need to build forts, and every capital in the game starts with a fort as a hard-coded thing, but you don't need this to be here. You can actually destroy the fort if you want to, and it would make you a little bit of money. So you'd lose out on the defensiveness in the fort level, but you won't have the output malice. Now, once you unlock Acropolis, this might be a good alternative. So if you would rather just, for example, min-max Atenai, right? You might say, I'm destroying the fort in Atenai. There it goes, right? And now there's no output malice. You can actually look over at the output modifier to see that it's gone. And you could instead, once you have the tech for it, build an Acropolis to provide the equivalent of 4 forts in terms of level, plus a 50% fort defense. And because the city already has 1 fort level, now you're looking at a plus 5 fort level, or I should say a 5 fort level in total. Then in terms of the ports, their 2 positive and 1 negative modifier is ship recruit speed 5% per port level, and 2 local monthly food per port level, but 10% reduced fort defense per port level. Because again, ports are opening up a way into your city, so it makes sense that a city with a very large port would have much more weakness to an attack. So a port in a city, and this is interesting because a port also allows a city to survive a siege more easily if it's not being blockaded, but by reducing the fort defense, it also makes the siege easier to win. So it kind of creates an interesting dynamic where if you have naval supremacy, ports are actually not as helpful defensively, because a port, when you don't have naval supremacy, or how should I phrase this? Okay, let me phrase this the right way. When you have naval supremacy, then you having a port is better defensively, but when you don't have naval supremacy, you having a port has a bigger problem defensively, because the port being blockaded, if you have naval supremacy, you're able to stop that. So hopefully that made sense. As for the Neorion, ship recruit speed 25% and local monthly food plus 10. Next we have the Oikos, basically the house, 5% local tax, 10 pop capacity, and -2 local monthly food is the malice. While the Patio Key, which I've not, there's an error in the localization that should say hasn't mentioned Patio Key, which is what it will require, adds 25% local tax and 50% pop capacity to the tile. And next up we have the Agara, the market. The bonuses are 20% local monthly food modifier and 1 base trade route, whereas the malice is a 20% governor wage malice for the province that the Agara is in. So definitely want to keep that in mind. If you build a lot of Agaras all over the place to boost up your commerce economy, you're going to be paying a ton of extra wages to that governor. All right, and then its stronger version building is the Lamani, which adds 100% local monthly food modifier and 5 base trade routes. Then finally, for the sort of buildings that work like this, actually there's one more. The Adagastadion, which adds in 10% supply limit, 1 base resource production per building, but reduces splendor by 0.10% per building. Whereas its stronger version, the Kaiterio, has a 50% supply limit bonus and a 5 base resource production addition. Then we have the Thumele, which reduces foreign culture happiness by 5% per layer, but also adds 1 pop assimilation speed and 20% pop assimilation speed per layer. Now, the idea with the Thumele is that if you build a bunch of them and you try to do it really quick, you can basically try to minimize the amount of time the foreign local pops have reduced happiness while assimilating them faster so that they become native pops. So it's kind of like a fun, kind of balancing act of minimizing the damage done by the foreign culture happiness modifier, but maximizing the benefit done by the assimilation modifier. Then its stronger version, the Naus, more pop assimilation speed plus 5, and pop assimilation speed plus 100%. Any sort of city that you're likely to see a lot of migration around, or a large population of non-native people. Having the nous will speed up population a ton. Finally, there are 4 buildings that are all just independent that are the same 5 years to build, 2,500 to get constructed, but they don't have any sort of weaker version. These are all for cities only. The Sita Potki, basically the granary, pop output 25%, a very powerful building with 400 food capacity as well. Keep in mind that it's 100 food capacity per tile across the board, whether city or settlement. So this is very, very good for getting more food capacity. Given the food situation in this mod, having more food capacity is actually pretty important for sure. Then there's the Gymnasium, 25% local manpower and 25% cohort starting experience for the tile. Pretty self-explanatory. Next up is the Theatron with 12.50% native culture happiness, which may seem like kind of a strange amount, but this is meant to pair with the Bolletarian, which is 12.50% state alignment happiness. So basically, with both of these buildings, you have a 25% happiness bonus for native culture and sort of native alignment pops, which is a very, very strong bonus. I wanted to split up like this. As you can also, with this in mind, choose to focus on boosting up if more of your pops are the correct alignment or more are the correct culture. For example, for Atenai, in the Asti province, this province is actually quite culturally diverse, but it's not alignment diverse. So having the Bolletarian is more effective than having the Theatron as an example, right? Okay, let's move over to the settlement buildings. So settlements use 2 buildings from the city buildings in the same way. They have access to the ports with the same modifiers and the Thumale with the same modifiers, but they also have 4 unique buildings. The Orkio, basically the mine, is 5% local tax, 1 base trade route, but minus 0.10% monthly splendor. Basically, this is your economy building for settlements, and this does not require a mineral resource. None of the settlement buildings or city buildings require any specific resources. I'm just using the idea of a mine to represent this is like a production building, almost kind of like mines in Civilization where they can be built anywhere, almost anywhere. Then we have the Zilefsi, which is a very interesting building, and I'm interested to hear people's feedback about this. This intentionally gives 1 global city building slot per Zifelici that you build. The idea here being that these lumber camps are basically supplying the resources to grow your cities, and not just like locally, like not for the province, for your entire nation. So as you build Zalefsis, you're able to get more and more city building slots. This is one of the few ways to get city building slots reliably in the mod. And my thinking with this is, although this seems like a really powerful thing because it affects your whole nation, so each individual Zalefsi is 1 more building slot for every single city in your country. You're also tying up the 1 slot of the settlement, because settlements can only have 1 building, with this buildings, right? So you're basically trading what the settlement could be to support your cities, which in the age of city-states feels very much like something one would choose to do. So this looks like a very weird bonus, but this is intentional. It's meant to work like this, and it'll be interesting to see what builds people come up with that use this kind of trade-off to basically lose the value that you could get otherwise from a tile to get 1 more city building slots in your cities. Next up is the Come, which provides 1 pop realignment and pop realignment speed modifier, and then it costs local monthly food. This basically allows you to deal with the incorrect alignment in different settlement tiles that you maybe conquer. It's basically the alignment version of the Thumale. Notice that cities don't have a version of this because cities are where Adastoi live, and the Adastoi provide realignment speed locally. So because settlements don't normally have Adastoi, and they actually aren't supposed to have Adastoi, this basically replaces the role that Adastoi play in realigning for settlement purposes. Even though it might be nice to have a version of this for cities, I think it's interesting to have to rely on the Adastoi to do your realigning for you if you plan to deal a lot with alignment shenanigans. Lastly is the Agroctime, which is basically, or I should say the Agroctima, basically like a farm complex. 2 monthly food, 20% local monthly food modifier, and governor wage plus 20%. Now this is basically so you can use tiles that aren't able to have ports to get food as a settlement, so otherwise you'd have to rely on the ports only, and many locations are settlements that don't have a port slot. Okay, so that is all of the buildings addressed, but we still have a long ways to go, as I now need to talk about, and this is thankfully not going to take too long, the trade goods. Now, it may look at first like I'm just opening up the trade goods menu from the base game, but if you look a bit more closely, all of these trade goods have been moved around. I've changed all of their values and I've also changed the names of the categories. So instead of having the trade goods be categorized as affecting different pop types, I've completely rethought the way pop happiness will work in this mod. Instead of trade goods being the main source of pop happiness, technology is the main source of pop happiness, among with some other like sort of strong effects like missions and whatnot. The economic tech tree is the main way to boost up pop happiness, with very few other sources of it. And trade goods, for now, I will change this before 1.0, for now trade goods have no surplus or local effect. They just have a commerce effect, because at the moment I want to have the commerce economy playstyle work, which requires the trade good rework that I'm going to show here. But so basically I don't want to mess around with the trade good modifiers until I've done everything else with the next couple of overhauls, because these need to basically be an additional system on top of all of the various modifiers to things like how diplomatic modifiers will work, or stability modifiers. So I need to basically wait to do this last. But what I have done is I've set all of their amounts, and I've also done a bunch of under the hood tinkering to change how the value of the commerce economy works. So basically trade goods, both import and export, are much more valuable, and they're also clearly more valuable in terms of the amounts of money that you gain from importing them. And the food trade goods also do bring in local monthly food, with the more valuable ones bringing in less and the cheaper ones bringing in more. So you can see, by the way, this is less monthly food than what you would get from the same trade goods in vanilla IR, as I've said before. Part of my overall goal with all these overhauls and changes is to create a genuine need to consider food carefully. So basically, there's not too much to say. I don't have anything localized. I'm going to change a lot of names later, but basically this is like an alpha version of the trade good system for Hegemony, with the values correctly set up, but without all the bells and whistles that make it more complicated later. So you can kind of just look at it yourself. You get the basic idea. And I have done some testing and figured out that for most city-states, you can basically achieve a fairly co-equal commerce or tax economy at the start of the game. Someone like Atenai that has a lot of trade slots has an easier time of it, but like with the vanilla game, the commerce economies tend to get more powerful as you go on, with tax economies being stronger early on. That's going to be true in this mod as well. Okay, that essentially wraps up. We've done pops, we've done buildings, we've done trade goods. Lastly, we've got the economic developments tech tree, and there is so much to talk about with this tech tree. So let me just go ahead and reveal the tree. Here it is. It may look at first like it's smaller than the military development tech tree, and it is slightly smaller in terms of the number of techs. It's just more fat, essentially. Instead of a really long, skinny tech tree, it's like a chunky boy, kind of squatting down. It's very dense, essentially, is what I'm trying to say. So let's go ahead and go through the tech tree after I drink a lot more coffee. Okay, oh my gosh. There we go. I accidentally hit that with my coffee cup. Starting off, we have initially two opening texts to pick between. First is Politeia. Politeia means many things. Citizenship, the essence of a city-state, the government. In this age of change and conflict, it must be an anchor to our citizens, our polites, by which their place in the world can be understood. We will do what we must to define Politeia for them. This provides a 25% research capacity bonus. I talked in the previous dev diary about how research capacity now works. And for most city-states, you actually kind of want to get research capacity pretty much right away, as it then enables you to get research faster, as most people start way above their research capacity. So I want research capacity to feel like a pressing issue so that you're tempted to go and grab this right away. The alternative is Demote. The Demote are residents of our polis who are not polites, not citizens. Though the traditional polis system is harsh to such men and their families, making even the barest effort to appease them will grant us the willing ear of a very productive class. When active, population happiness 10%, a very powerful modifier to get early on, given how low all of the starting happiness amounts are for most locations. You can see here that there are the base. So first of all, let me talk for a second about pop happiness. The base happiness I've changed to 0% for everybody. I've also managed to make two interesting changes to how pop output works. First of all, I've removed the minus 30% pop output, which means that even a super unhappy pop still generates a little bit of something. If you don't know the pop system in Imperator super well, you may not really know what I'm talking about. essentially in regular Imperator Rome, and in Hegemony until this patch, a pop that was below a certain threshold, typically under 30% output, produced 0 of anything, because the negative 30% default output overrode whatever output they actually had. By making the default output sort of 0% and then just having modifiers add or subtract from it, essentially, unless a pop has 0 or less output, it will produce a little tiny bit of its different resources. This is much more interesting and creates a situation where you're no longer needing to just maintain everyone above 30% to get something from them. Even a super unhappy, super low output, super debuffed pop type will still produce a little tiny bit of something for you. Now, along with this, I've done something even more interesting that I didn't even know was possible. I've also managed to get rid of the dominant cultures not integrated output malice. In Imperator Rome normally, if a tile has a local culture majority that's not your native culture or not integrated, then there's a massive negative 100% population output applied to the tile to punish you for it. This, although a major gameplay mechanic in affecting how growth works, to me just doesn't really make sense. Just because the majority of a population of a tile isn't, for example, Athenian, right? Here, the Acarnanian population is the majority in Acarnai. They're Attic, right? They're sort of like a sister culture of the Athenians. Like, sure, they're not Athenian, but just because the Athenians aren't the majority, the entire tile shouldn't lose all of its output just because of that. So essentially, I removed that mechanic entirely, which has the general effect, along with the removal of the sort of minimum output thing that I mentioned a moment ago, of increasing the productivity of everyone across the entire map. So this is part of why there's tons of resources all over the place, right? If I open up my import thing, there's a lot of resources available just right away. And if you were to increase your diplomatic range, you could reach even more people, as many different tiles will be able to produce multiple copies of resources, especially as they start to improve the happiness of their thetes. Right? The thetes provide so much resource production as they get happier and happier. So, having said all that, the pop happiness from the tech tree, like I said earlier, the tech tree is the main source of pop happiness, as I want the general sort of experience, the general kind of arc of a campaign, instead of being you start the campaign off, there's kind of a basic amount of like neutral happiness that works fine, and then you get stronger. I wanted to start off with you struggling for your life. Like I want the early game of Hegemony campaigns to feel like you're playing on hard mode. Like you need to truly understand how happiness and output works in order to get your population under control. And the tech tree is basically the gradual, in the economic tech tree, is the gradual ascension and cleaning up of all of the problems with all of your pops as you tech by tech, give them more happiness, and then later give them more output. And so, essentially, the economic tech tree, because in this game your economy is so oriented around your pops, and my mod is further, made that part of how it works. This tech tree is mostly focused on pop happiness or output, but also has a couple other modifiers here and there. So let's just go ahead and get started. So the basic structure, by the way, is the Politeia section is sort of where citizen and noble bonuses, right? So polites and adastoi, basically modifiers that relate to kind of the higher learning and like the kind of more bourgeoisie part of your polis, for lack of a better word, can be sort of focused on. The center section deals with the metoikoi and helping you define their place in your polis, and the right section deals with the industrial capacity of your polis, right? The denizens that are not like really the bourgeoisie, but rather kind of like the underclass that's being exploited by you to make all your goods, right? And other sort of things related to that, sort of the industrial side over here. So that's the basic way this is structured. As you can tell, the metoikoi, you can start this line from either side because they kind of represent a middle ground between citizens and non-citizens. They're literally non-citizens, right? That's what defines them. But their social their social power is more complicated, as they have wealth, they often have a lot of means, and they can basically use their personal power and abilities to achieve some parity with the citizenry, and they're not like an exploited underclass. So that's kind of the difference here. So starting off over here with the adastoi, a minority of the polites hold themselves above their countrymen, considering themselves a nobleman, while the wealth and estates they inherit They mark them as different to other citizens. They are men all the same and just as capable of guiding to our ends. 5% national Adastoi happiness. Next to them are the politis. Citizenship in the polis is more than a cultural birthright. It is a very powerful legal status, one which all the politis, whether Adastoi or not, value deeply. Our citizens must be taught not to only their purpose to the polis, but what they must do to achieve it. 5% politis happiness. Then heading down here, the happiness line for the Adastoi starts with arete. To the Adastoi, their lineage cannot be a sufficient explanation for their heightened station above the other politis. They believe, and we would do well to affirm, that they have earned their position by demonstrating arete, virtue, in what they do. 5% more happiness. Next up is time. Honor is a common arete sought by Adastoi, be it in intellectual pursuits or by donning the dory and aspis and marching to war. Whatever purpose they can best serve to the polis, we will guide them to find their time on our terms. 5% more happiness. Then the final, the second to last happiness bonus is sophrosyne. Sophrosyne, self-restraint, is often regarded as the highest virtue and truest arete which Adastoi could achieve. By encouraging this concept, we stand to gain much for little. After all, they're doing all the work to convince themselves they are good. This then is one way to unlock timokratia. A timokratia is ruled not by one man, nor by every man, but only by the men most worthy to rule. Such a state is unpracticable, of course. But the more our Adastoi believe they live within a timokratia, the more willing they are to support us in all we do. This provides the last 5% happiness bonus for a total of 25% once you go all the way through here, and the first output bonus of 5%. Stepping over here briefly, we have the Sophistes line, which comes from Adastoi. This is pop realignment speed, flat pop realignment speed in every single tile, 0.50. Sophistry, the teaching of virtue, is an old and valuable discipline. Valuable, that is, in how we put just the right words in their mouths and ensure the next generation of tutored youths grow up with the right ideas, for the right price, of course. This unlocks rhetorique. The sophists have proven that speechcraft is an art, and like any artist, some will serve our purposes more reliably than others. Styles and mediums may vary, but for the right price we can ensure only our preferred virtues are to be taught for another 0.50 pop realignment speed nationwide. Finally, eristique. Rhetorique is rather like a weapon. Short, sharp, and piercing may do well and good if subtlety is one's goal, but these days ideas are getting our people killed. We need to equip our speakers with heavier armaments if we hope to win the war. 1 pop realignment speed nationwide for all tiles. And then, over here in the politis line, we have their first happiness, second happiness bonus, diakosun. Diakosun, justice, is the great concern of our citizens. Some even believe we exist to ensure justice is done. To reassure the politis that their polis is fundamentally good, we ought to take the effort to institutionalize justice as the stated goal behind our systems. This unlocks thesmoi. Many believe that thesmoi, written laws, are how our polis can achieve diakosun. A nice idea, one the polites are all too happy to accept. After all, by ordering their world with human rules, the chaos of nature will seem beneath their concern. Finally, axones. Pioneered by Drakon and later Solon, the axones are great wooden tablets upon which the thesmoi are inscribed. The polites consider open visibility of all laws paramount to their freedoms. If that's all it takes, we have some opportunities ahead of us. 5% more politis happiness. This unlocks the way to aristocratia. An aristocratia is ruled by the wisest among our politis, a convenient invention for the intellectuals who aspire that we become such a state. There is value, however, in presenting ourselves as advancing in this direction. The love of the politis will surely follow. The final 5% for a 25% total, and 5% output as well. Then over here we have the philosophy line, starting with physikoi. Great thinkers, to use the title they bestow themselves, have always pondered at the workings of the world. Irritating as they may be, their insights should not be disregarded. They may be able to help us understand the people of our polis. This adds 5% more maximum research capacity, and again, in my playthroughs, in my campaigns, I'm probably going to go straight through this line immediately to get more capacity, to get more research from my research. Next up is testimonia. Testimonia record the teachings of physikoi, aiding us in understanding their ideas, where the half-remembered accounts of old students fail us. Though these texts are valuable, we must take care to ensure they remain within our close control. Such works are powerful. 7.50% more research capacity. Finally, philosophia. Day by day, a new school of thought is rising up to supplant the notions of the physicoi, one that favors debates and disagreement over declarations. Strange as it seems, this way of thinking may enable a more efficient kind of learning. We must investigate. Now, you may be wondering, why am I characterizing philosophy in classical Greece like this? Because famously, classical Greece was a center of philosophy. It was after the Peloponnesian War. We're in a slightly pre-Socratic era, as Socrates probably, not just probably, Socrates almost for sure was alive during the Peloponnesian War and fought in the war. But his gadfly activity really got going in the aftermath of the war as a reaction to the new state of things in Athenae during the oligarchic period. So the depths of the Socratic situation aren't really something I want to represent in this tree, because they're not part of the Hellenic world widely yet, as it were. So what I'm doing is sort of pointing to the pre-Socratic, kind of more ancient and early classical Hellenic philosophical traditions, like the Physokoi, as opposed to just referencing more well-known stuff that happens a bit later in time. Anyways, the Sophrosyne and the Oxonis lead to Perioki, which I need to rename to because this is what it needs to be is Perioki is right. So I need to change this code to point to this other one. So I'll fix that later. Anyways, Perioki, our polis swells with citizens seeking shelter behind our walls. From every corner of the countryside they flock. We cannot keep up with the demand for additional housing. We must commit to building vaster projects, great districts to house our people. This grants 10% national manpower and unlocks that district building that I mentioned before. This is the one that adds more local tax and pop capacity in a city. Okay, and from here we then go down to the second row of the of this side of the tech tree. First of all, I'll just go with the center one first, Fratria. Many Hellenes look to the Fratria, complex webs of families and clans, to track the birthright which legally facilitates citizenship. To entice foreigners living among us to do their part for the polis, we should begin easing such restrictions. Pop simulation speed nationwide, plus 0.50. Apatoria. The Apatoria is a popular festival centered around the Fratria and involving many rites and rituals intended to signify the relationships between various members to one another. Often confusing, yes, but an excellent way to further expand the Fratria. Another plus 0.50 pop simulation speed. Lastly, with 1 pop simulation speed nationwide, is Isagoria. Isagoria is the right of all citizens to address political bodies. The gentle expansion of this powerful privilege will encourage foreigners to participate in our systems. And while some polities will complain, the polis itself will only grow stronger with their inclusion. Then we have the remaining output bonuses for both Adastoi and Politis. Remember, we had 5% here. Here with 10% is Atimia for the Adastoi. The right to participate in our polis, whether true or perceived, is a cherished one. Though the Adastoi may prefer all other polities be found Atimos, without honor, and stripped of citizenship, the careful use of this process will still be popular with them, for more output from the Adastoi. Over here with Doki Masia, 10% more national Adastoi output. Though citizenship is inherited in our polis, some polities may present a problem for the established order if allowed access to the full range of public life. The process of dokimasia will allow us to put such troublemakers on trial to prove their capacity and loyalty. Lastly is nomophilakia. The polities may hold decision-making powers in some ways, but the Adastoi know that nomophilakia, the responsibility to safeguard the laws, rests with them alone. Of course, in preserving this belief, they commit themselves to serve the polis with even greater aplomb. 25% Adastoi output for a total of 50% output from this line over here. Then for the polities, starting with aristocratia with the 5%, 10% from Boule. The polities expect that the foundation of any civilized city-state ought to be a collective government within which they hold the say. In giving them the illusion that this is the way of their polis, they will put themselves to work to do our business. 10% politis output. Ecclesia. The assembly of citizens in which all polities are given their chance to be heard may seem to open the door to mob rule. However, wise men know that the ship of state will sail the furthest when carried by the winds. The ecclesia will be invaluable to our aims. 10% more politis output. Finally, Heliaia. The Supreme Court of our state reassures the politis that their polis is orderly, organized, and just, and so they work, fight, and die for it. What this court does and why it does so will matter less than how it appears to hold itself above the citizenry. 25% politis output. And then, when you combine Isagoria and Nomophilakia, notice that, by the way, that a lot of these are optional, one or the other, but the ones that are darker you require both. You are then able to unlock Isonomia with both Nomophilakia and Isagoria. maximum splendor plus 10 for all provinces. For the law to regard all polities equally, regardless of wealth, prestige, or virtue, seems completely impossible. Yet our polis is acclaimed for having made such efforts to achieve the system. Such civilizational achievements are the pride of all Hellenes. And then over here, requiring both Isogoria and Helaya, is Isokratia, monthly splendor plus 0.50%. The true equality of power, true fairness between all polities, is seen by many as completely unattainable. However, to the few who work tirelessly to bring it about, no sacrifice will be too great. Such altruists will strengthen the polis in their effort, optimistic as they are. And then, once you have Isonomia and Isokratia, which requires you, given the way that this is structured, to either have all the politis and Edastoi stuff, or you can also have all the Edastoi and Metoikoi stuff, or all the politis and Metoikoi stuff, in order to reach this line over here. You can then get down here and pick between, like with the military developments tree, one of two options. They cancel each other out. The first option is Elenkos. This adds 100% pop realignment speed nationwide. The citizens of our city-state have, for better or worse, become enamored with the gadflies, intellectuals who increasingly disrupt the order with political dialogues. Perhaps with a bit of creativity, we can find ways to leverage them for the good of the polis. So, like with all of the capstone texts, this references stuff that happens later than the Peloponnesian War, and here we're looking at the emergence of the kind of Socratic, Platonic, philosophical school, and what this means for the potential to realign people very efficiently. Alternatively is Utopia. After years of effort to not only understand but guide the citizens of our city-state, they have come to at last to trust in us. Our polis is regarded as a utopia, a good place. With their trust in hand, we will put them to use in ways when we could once only imagine. 15% state alignment happiness. So the gameplay implication here is you either are having a lot of pops, maybe added to conquest, that are the wrong alignment. This allows you to really achieve much more efficient alignment in the endgame, whereas this basically allows you to strengthen the pops you already have that are your current alignment. You have to pick between them. Okay, now we shift over to the Metoikoi line, starting with Metoikoi. Metoikoi are denizens of our polis and have, or once had, citizenship from another. This status is inherited by their children, and so they will always remain apart from the politis, but with the right of appeasements, there is much and more being gained from them, 5% happiness. Next is Pinakia. Traditionally, Metoikoi have been required to identify themselves to the community of politis they wish to live amidst. Systematizing this process will limit the abuses Metoikoi must suffer from suspicious politis who might interfere with the process, 5% more happiness. Prostatis. Beyond registration, Metoikoi also require a prostatis, a politis sponsor, to vouch for them. Though cumbersome, this process does build relationships between Metoikoi and politis, relationships we can leverage as wealthy foreigners come to join our polis, 5% more happiness. Next up for 5% more happiness is Isotelia. On rare occasion, Metoikoi have been granted Isotelia, equal rights, if not equal status, to politis, and given the potential value of our polis if our wealthiest and best connected Metoikoi invest in their new home, we should encourage this practice far more often. And this actually is 10% happiness because I want this to sell it up to 25%, so this is 10%. Finally, Lamani, and this should be unlocking the other building, and I need to fix that in code for maybe a follow-up patch, maybe a 6.1. National commerce income plus 10%. The Metoikoi offer access to an untapped world of commercial gain, so long as we invest in the infrastructure to secure it. Grander markets, bustling farms, and import-export tax here or there, such things will fill our treasury with coin. Right. This then is one of the ways you can reach down to the politis output line, and you also get access to the Metoikoi output line with Metoikoin. Now that we've thoroughly integrated the Metoikoi to our polis, it's time to reap what we've sown. The Metoikoin is an additional tax levied on Metoikoi to further fund the polis they've chosen to call home. Some may complain, but most will be far too invested to leave, 10% more output. 15% more output from Zenica. The Metoikoi have done much to bring foreign commerce to our polis, but given their limited legal standing, we can continue profiting from their enterprise. The Zenica taxes do them as they do business in our markets, and we will use these additional funds well. Next up, with 25% output for a total of 50%, is Drachme. Our taxation of the Metoikoi has revealed just how diverse the currencies they bring to our polis truly are. Perhaps by pivoting our focus to openly exploiting the Metoikoi, or rather from openly exploiting the Metoikoi, to using a softer touch, their many silver coins will flow more freely into our waiting treasury. And then, this, along with Helea, unlocks Glaucius for 25% import value. For decades, Athenai has spread her distinctive coin, the Glaucius, to markets far and wide across the Hellenic world. Ensuring we maintain a stockpile of Glaucius will secure an advantage for us in negotiating trade deals to sell our own goods abroad. And since the citizenry and the Metoikoi both reflect kind of trade routes, importing, their shared modifier is import value, whereas the one with the Thetes is obviously the export one. But we'll come back. Actually, we'll talk about the Thetes now in order to then get down to here. So with the Thetes, their first modifier, of course, is 5% national Thetes happiness. Thetes are the free people of our polis who, though lacking formal citizenship, enjoy some limited rights and civic responsibilities. Indeed, though the polites may dismiss them as uneducated laborers, we would be wise to understand this portion of our people. This then unlocks Medimni. The Thetes were once formally, and at least remain informally, defined by their income of less than 150 Medimni, an old standard of currency, per year. Far from restricting them to the status, we must encourage the Thetes to imagine the prospect of advancement, 5% more happiness. Bema. The Thetes, almost as a rule, lack the social connections necessary to affect policy the traditional way. However, they often make their presence known at public gatherings. We should ensure public speakers have a proper stage from which to address them, 5% more happiness. For Thetes. Stoia. It is clear that Thetes value their limited access to civic events, even if such access is illusory. We should invest in the infrastructure that allows even more to attend public speeches, so even more Thetes can attend and feel as though they have a voice in the polis. 5% more happiness for Thetes. And then over here, we've got Demiurgos. By recognizing and taking the effort to make a place for the Thetes, they are ready and willing to get to work for the polis. We must encourage this by propagating the concept of the Demiurgos, the creative craftsman whose work is worthy of respect. 5% happiness and 5% output. Over here we have the different orders line. First with the Doric, oh my gosh, I'm losing my voice. The Doric Rhythmos, which is the Doric order. The oldest and some would say the truest form of Hellenic architecture is the Doric style fluted columns, supporting simple circular structures upon which the roof would disperse its weight evenly. With such designs, the Hellenic world took its shape. 10% reduced build cost and build time. Next up is the Ionian Rhythmos. The addition of scroll-shaped caps to the tops of columns defines the Ionian form, along with thinner columns and shallower fluting. These additions, while seemingly inconsequential, drastically differentiate this new form from the old. 15% more build cost and build time. And then K Rhythmos, or Corinthiakos Rhythmos, I couldn't fit it in the UI, or as it's often abbreviated, K Rhythmos, is the newest and most complex form of column design. Though named in reference to the ostentatious Corinthians, this elaborate style actually originated in Athenai, which is true. 25% further reduced build cost and build time. So notice, by the way, for just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 inventions, that's actually 50% reduced build time and build cost, which, given how expensive and time-consuming building is, if you plan to do a lot of building, it actually behooves you to take some time to go grab these early on. Alright, and then let's continue down this direction with the Technites, which requires either this tech or the Demiurgos. Some few Thetes prove themselves greater at their craft than their fellow craftsmen, or so we will say. The prospect of distinguishing themselves as Technites will be a great motivator to the Thetes, motivation from which we stand to profit, 10% output from the Thetes. Thanoisoi. If a Thetes working alone is productive, it goes without saying that many Thetes working in unison will achieve greater outputs, the whole being greater than the sum of its parts. Surely they won't mind getting a little cramped if it's for the good of the city-state, 10% national Thetes output. Lastly in this line is Krematistai. National Thetes output 25% for a total of 50%. It's clear that while working as Banosoi, the craftsmen and workers alike have been able to produce quantities of goods heretofore considered impossible for our polis. As long as the Thetes continue to believe there is honor in their work, they will continue to work. This, along with drachmae, allows for decadrachm. From distant Sedekuse, the giant silver decadrachm impresses with its sheer value. Were we to mint our own currency in such design, the wealth of our markets would seem apparent. Foreign buyers would seek out our goods with renewed interest. 25% increased export value for that. And now we can talk about the Metoikoi option down here, as we've now made our way in terms of what's required to reach down here. So you can pick between Patioikoi or Koinonia. So let's start over here. Patioikoi. This allows for 10% foreign culture happiness and 20% foreign culture group happiness. Basically, this removes the hegemony happiness malices for foreign culture and foreign culture group, which are 10 and 20% respectively. So with this unlocked, all foreign culture, all non-native pops will have native pop levels of happiness, without on top of other modifiers, of course. The age of city-states fades away, and the clear division between polites and metoikoi goes with it. In the times ahead, where insular communities give way to vaster multicultural nations, a new term is needed to describe the changing world we rule. And by the way, the term patioikoi was actually the kind of new term used to describe what was essentially the Hellenic Age version of metoikoi, so that's what this is in reference to naming-wise. Over here is koinonia. As we leave the era of the polis behind, we mustn't abandon the advantages we've learned. Citizenship holds as a status for which men will fight and die. Koinonia, rightful place in a community, is a powerful motivator. In fact, it may just be our greatest trick of all. This is a very strong 100% pop assimilation speed, so basically you can pick between having a multicultural society with no downsides, no happiness downsides, I should say. Obviously there's like levy downsides. Or everyone gets assimilated with the huge assimilation bonus over here. You can kind of imagine what I would do in my campaigns, but you can pick between them, and I'm trying to balance them to both be feasible as options. Okay, lastly is the Dwaloi. The Dwaloi are simply enough slaves. There are many varieties of Dwaloi, and though their owners compel the labor from them, they remain mouths we must feed, and very potentially sparks to ignite our polis if we do not take their presence here seriously. 5% Dwaloi output to start. Next up is Halis Skomai, 5% more output. Traditionally, Dwaloi have been made, not born, though the children of Dwaloi are typically their owner's property. Most Dwaloi in ages past were captured in war. These days, with the ease by which new Dwaloi can be acquired, those currently in chains can be worked hard. Next up is Andrapuran, with 5% more Dwaloi output. Dwaloi are often mocked as Andropuran, one with a man's feet, to distinguish them from the cattle they are traded alongside. Such cruelty strikes the polites as necessary to retain the necessary illusion, I should rephrase that, it's not phrased very well, that the humanity of each class is different from the other. Then is Oiketes, 5% more national Dwaloi output. Not all Dwaloi are used in the field. Some lucky few are assigned duties in the home. As our prosperity grows and our food supplies increasingly flow into revolts from foreign sources, the number of Oiketes is sure to increase as field work becomes less necessary. And then we have the Sisakthea tech. This is 5% happiness for 25% total, and then the first 5% output bonus. The Sisakthea was an Athenian reform, one which cancelled all outstanding debts and emancipated all Dwaloi enslaved due to debt. Though such reforms irritate the polites, it would benefit our polis to consider implementing this idea. And then to back up here, we have the food capacity bonuses. First with Amphodius. Use of large sealed vases to store food is a Hellenic tradition passed down for centuries. These vessels, just as much as good harvests and productive fishermen, have fed our polis in years past. In the times to come, they will continue to be invaluable. 100 base food capacity for all tiles, which doubles all tiles food capacity, by the way, with this tech. Next up is Pelike for another 200 to all tiles. Though less common than the Amphodius, the Pelike is formed as one piece. These fine goods improve our ability to store foodstuffs in leaner seasons, and these days the threat of enemy armies destroying good harvests has become a serious threat. This unlocks Pitoi. The largest vessels regularly found in Hellenic granaries, the Pitoi allow even greater quantities of food to be safely stored away. We must begin crafting these great containers to ensure each and every bit of harvest is accounted for by our officials. 300 base food capacity for all tiles. And either this or Oiketes allows for this one down here. Now, both Stoia and Oiketes also allows for Giterio. Individual workshops have proven productive and profitable. Why not think bigger? Scaling our operations at the level of industrial complexes from which the sinews of work and flow will fund our efforts for ages to come. And this unlocks, of course, the larger workshop building. Right. And then this can unlock the pop promotion bonus, first with Musike. Training in the arts of the muses, Musike, is invaluable for the advancement of any Hellene in society. If our polis is to encourage those who can to advance their station in life, we must formalize and encourage Musike wherever we can, 20% pop promotion speed. Next up is Gymnastike, 30% pop promotion speed. Alongside Musike, those seeking to better themselves also secure an education in Gymnastike, physical training and conditioning. Should we support this practice, those who succeed in our polis will be able to offer brawn as well as brains. Lastly, Paidotrebe. Self-education may be well and good, but a good Paidotrebe, a teacher of musicae and gymnasticae, can make all the difference. This reality provides us an opportunity to promote those Paidotrebe who advocate for the way of life most useful to Polis. 50% population speed for a total of 100% out of these three together. Then we get to the slave happiness bonus. I didn't mention this earlier, but the slaves actually start, or the dwellers start with output bonuses, not happiness, because they're actually more important for their output than for their happiness. Remember that their output is not affected by happiness, but their happiness does affect unrest, and I consider dwellers output more important early on than happiness, whereas other pops it's the reverse of that. So, starting things off with Cores Oikuentes. Dwellers have occasionally purchased their own freedom from their owners, though this has always been uncommon. However, we are confident that dwellers will endeavor in this miserable labor more readily if they believe such options are just around the corner. 5% more national dwellers happiness. Next up is Arenos with 5% more dwellers national happiness. On even rare occasion than Cores Oikointes, some dwellers have secured their freedom with a loan provisioned by their owner directly. Some few understand that a grateful free man is of far greater value than a furious enslaved one. Indeed, we stand to benefit too. Finally, for the happiness line for the dwellers is Eleutheros. Some speak wistfully of a day slavery is abandoned in Hellas at last, when all people in the polis can at least count themselves as free. Whether this day will come or not, for now, we stand to benefit from the promise of liberation and the motivation it brings. Anyways, next up we have Neorio. Our Neorions are vital infrastructure for shipbuilding, and if we intend to secure any sort of naval advantage, we must invest in specializing those Thetes who prove themselves most suited to the work within them to truly master their craft. 50% reduced shipbuilding cost. By the way, it should be noted that shipbuilding... Actually, no, that's not right. Yeah, never mind. I was about to say something, but that's incorrect. Yeah, so shipbuilding cost reduction from this is huge to be able to build large navies later in the late game. The other option over here, and you don't have to pick between them, but the other option that's next to it is Paramone. For some dwellers, the depth of their powerlessness is hard to comprehend. Sent from site to site as human chattel, forced to work in crowded conditions for distant, uncaring masters, what kind of civilized people would force them to endure such a fate? Oh, right. Okay, so I was a little cheesy there. Also, I didn't mention this. Paramone is a 50% move dwelling cost reduction, which is nice to grab. Also, because there's no longer any modifier from vegetables, you're no longer going to need to, I'll say you, I mean me, no longer going to need to actually put on vegetables or put on stone, like for just a second to do building or moving slaves or whatnot. So those like kind of annoying additional things you need to do for just that one moment, I'm trying to get rid of that kind of part from the game, from the mod. Alright, next up is Kapondoi. Merchant guilds organizing and regulating how commerce is to be conducted were once a rare sight, oh my god, in any polis. Increasingly, however, their aid in securing important deals at scale is proving invaluable, especially as the primacy of self-sufficient city-states starts to fade away. 10 province import routes in every single province from this innovation. And the alternative is autarkia for 100% global monthly food modifier. The times are changing, and if we remain dependent on foreign foodstuff to stave off starvation at home, our place in the world can never grow beyond where we began. If we hope to survive in the ages to come, we must be able to feed ourselves without fail. So this is basically having to do with how you decide to handle your food supply, whether you want to grow your own food or import lots of food. This could also, of course, be a backdoor way to get a better commerce economy if you have a good food situation, but I'm hoping the way I balanced it will prevent you from ever having true food security in this mod. So that is the economic developments tree explained in agonizing length. I'm about to lose my voice and I'm about to collapse. So thank you all so much for watching this very brisk and very concise dev diary. Hopefully all of my additional context and commentary was interesting and helped explain what I'm trying to do with this update. This is a huge update, and of all the times to play the Hegemony Alpha just as kind of a sandbox experience, the new changes I've made with this update do make it feel as fun to play as it's ever felt so far. Of course, as I continue adding in more stuff, it's going to get even better. That's the whole hope. But for now, I'm really happy with how 0.6 has turned out, and I hope to see you all very soon on the Hegemony Discord as I continue to work on the mod and get to work on what will come next. Probably a 0.6.1 to fix a couple of small errors in 0.6 and to just make some additional small changes, nothing too major, before I get to work on 0.7, which will be the big, likely going to be a combination diplomacy and character overhaul, as they're not necessarily super related, but the culture developments tech tree will likely have both diplomacy and like character stuff. So I will get to work on that. But thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you all next time.